Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name's Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined by Jared Nelson and Scott Edburgs, and we are here to talk about BCO 23, which I didn't check ahead of time, but might be the longest chapter title of any chapter in the book. The Dissolution of the Pastoral Relation and the Procedure for Honorable Retirement. At least it has the most long words, I would reason to guess. We are going to jump into it, but first I was going to check in with the guys. You know, we know how our listeners love our back and forth banter, and they want to hear about our lives. So, Jared, I saw some commercials during the Super Bowl and some huge billboards outside of town that you were speaking at some conference, I think. I mean, when was it? How big of a deal? How many tens of thousands of dollars were you paid to do it? That would tell us all the things we want to know.
Yeah, if you know who Matthew Everhart is, he's a pastor in my presbytery, and his church hosts a conference every year on different topics. One has just been on the Puritans. This year it was on the relationship between the church and state and government. So I actually got to do one of the breakout sessions. I'm not one of the marquee speakers. That was T. David Gordon, Jonathan Watt, and Jay Nykirk. Those were the main speakers, but I got to lead a breakout of a few of the people that wanted to come hear the differences between the American and the original Westminster Confession of Faith on the civil magistrate. So, yeah, it'll be selling like hotcakes if they ever put out a.
Were all the guys there Two Kingdom? I mean, I know that T. David Gordon's a Two Kingdom guy. Was that the culture of the conference?
No, it was a mixture of. There's a lot of Covenanter guys that are RP guys. And PCA guys. So that's what was interesting about it is we were coming from different places. In fact, my breakout was kind of like how do we all agree? And that's actually what I focused on between the American and the original was how are they actually very similar and applying a similar principle of the spirituality of the church, but differently. So that was kind of my challenge of I'm going to have a room full of Covenanters and maybe 2K leaning PCAers. So how do I bring them together?
Well, last time we were together, we went through BCO 22 on the pastoral relations, and 23 gets into how these relations are dissolved. So pastors, associate pastors, and assistant pastors are connected to the church and the presbytery in certain ways, but there are times in the life of ministry and seasons that ministers leave for one reason or another, and the call, the relationship between the church and the minister has to be dissolved. And so that's what 23 outlines for us. 23.1 has 3 paragraphs that are pretty sizable, so we're just going to take each one of those on its own, and then we'll hit paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 individually. So pretty short chapter, but we'll stretch it out as long as we can. 23-1, when any minister shall tender the resignation of his pastoral charge to his presbytery, the presbytery shall cite the church to appear by its commissioners to show cause why the presbytery should or should not accept the resignation. If the church fails to appear, or if its reasons for retaining its pastor be deemed insufficient, his resignation shall be accepted and the pastoral relation dissolved. So right off the bat, we see that a pastor leaving a church is not just a matter of giving 2 weeks' notice to the congregation and then just hightailing it out of there. There's a whole process involved. Significance here, guys. What's going on? Why is it so weighty?
Well, Steve talked last time about how there needs to be 3 parties that agree to a call, and so we have to be reminded there has to be 3 parties that agree to a dissolution. And in this, when the pastor is resigning, the presbytery has to know about it, and in fact, it has to go before them. I think it's interesting what Morton Smith says about it. If I could just read his second paragraph in his commentary, says, it should be observed that a congregation is not required to concur with the pastor at his request for dissolution. In such cases, the presbytery must make the decision. Generally speaking, the expressed desires of a pastor determine the matter. In other words, they're probably going to say yes. There have been occasions, however, when a congregation comes with such strong arguments for the man to be retained that the presbytery may refuse to dissolve the relationship. Such occasions can bring a renewal in the work of the pastor and the life of the congregation. just an interesting idea of a situation where whether the pastor is burnt out or the pastor has had some sort of a falling out or there's been some sort of a conflict and he's like, I resign. And the congregation is just like, no, like you don't need to resign because of that. I have heard of a pastor offering to his session to resign and this session all saying, no, don't do it. But I don't think it got to the formal place. So he was saying there may have been an instance of this. I haven't heard of an instance where a pastor went to resign and was told no. I don't know if you guys have heard of that.
Not in the Presbyterian side of things. I think I heard of John MacArthur seeking to resign Grace Community once because of the unbelief of one of his sons, I believe. And the elders there said, no, that's not a legitimate reason, and so we're going to reject your resignation letter. And so I've heard of it, and like it's a rare case, not something that's common. Typically, if someone wants to leave, they're let go.
Scott, you're a clerk of a presbytery. I mean, what would this look like? Maybe you've seen it, or where you can at least walk us through. I mean, they're going to show up. How does this go? Because I don't think I've seen this happen very often in this way.
Yeah, often churches, they forego their rights in this regard, but it functions almost, I think, like a hearing, at least it could, where there's a rep from the session that acts on behalf of the church and offers the church's interests in the matter before the presbytery, while the minister also can represent himself before the presbytery. A lot of churches don't send a guy to represent their interests in this, mostly because it's not controversial. And again, if a guy wants to leave, it's really hard to keep a guy, because once it's known that he wants to leave, there's almost like a divorcing relationship that begins to happen between the minister and the church. Even with close friends, your relationships change instantly when there is a desire or known desire that one party wants to separate. And so there is the possibility, at least in our law or our book right here, where it allows for the session or the church to have representation, though it's often not utilized.
Well, so this first paragraph sets up when a minister wants to resign. There's also, as Jared pointed out, several relationships, and so there's the other side of this, and that's the second paragraph of BCO 23-1. If any church desires to be relieved of its pastor, a similar procedure shall be observed. But whether the minister or the church initiates proceedings for a dissolution of the relation, there shall always be a meeting of the congregation called and conducted in the same manner as the call of the pastor. In any case, the minister must not physically leave the field until the presbytery or its commission empowered to handle uncontested requests for dissolution has dissolved the relation. So it branches out a little further into what has to happen after this, but there's this first part that if a church desires to be relieved, they follow a similar process. They would approach the presbytery, the pastor would be involved in the conversation, but in either way, there has to be a congregational meeting, and there's a physicality aspect to this as well. And we see these things in play in other ways. What stands out to you guys here on this end of things?
There has to be a congregational meeting, and that is difficult. Even a guy that is doing a bad job, this is probably why associates and assistant roles exist in their distinguished manners, is that if a guy is doing a terrible job and he's objectively a bad pastor, he's still going to have friends and those whom love him in the congregation, and it's going to be a grueling experience to discuss this as the church side of things seeking to dissolve this, because it just doesn't feel great, right? It doesn't feel great firing someone, and there's a reason why it's hard, and that's why I think assistants exist, because of how hard it is to tell a guy you're no longer going to be our pastor. And so the notable thing is that a congregational meeting must happen when there's a pastor having his call dissolved, because the congregation called the man, the congregation also dissolves the call of the man, and it's grueling, even if it's rightly done.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing between these two paragraphs is the difference. If a pastor wants to resign and then goes through this process, he basically can be convinced out of it, right? But on the other end of that, if the church says you're fired and has done it properly, they can't really be talked out of it. That's one of the questions here, as if the presbytery can say no. And the constitutional inquiries that have come up in the church and the cases that have come up have basically said, no, if you have done it properly, then the presbytery can't deny it. However, it does say that the minister shouldn't leave the field, because it may be that the congregation didn't do it properly. Maybe they just said, okay, that was a terrible sermon. Everybody raise your hand if you want to get rid of this guy. And, okay, no, that wasn't proper. The presbytery can say, if you really want to do this, you have to go through the proper way. But if they've done it properly with a duly called congregational meeting and they've checked all the boxes, presbytery basically just has to recognize it.
Should we amend this paragraph to say that these congregational meetings can't happen on Mondays? Just same reason as a pastor shouldn't write his letter on a Monday.
Yeah,
always going to be Friday, Saturday afternoon.
You gotta give them time to rethink.
Oh man. Okay, so the whole section keeps going. Third paragraph. So imagining now that the pastor's gone for one reason or another, the associate or assistant pastors may continue to serve a congregation when the pastoral relation of the senior pastor is dissolved, but they may not normally succeed the senior pastor without an intervening term of service in a different field of labor. However, a congregation by a secret ballot with 4/5 majority may petition 4/5 majority vote may petition presbytery for an exception, which by a 3/4 majority vote presbytery may grant. Presbytery needs to determine if the dissolution of the pastoral relationship with the senior pastor was brought about in Christian love and good order on the part of the parties concerned. There's a lot going on here. You don't want a church to stage a coup and try to get their associate or their assistant into the senior pastor position. That's obviously what's being protected here. I want to know about the guy who went and worked in a different field of labor for a time and then came back. I mean, how long has he got to go? How far does he have to be? Does he have to move houses? There's a lot going on here. I'm rambling.
It's a Farewell kind of thing with Calvin. You know, you got to go to Strasbourg before you could come back to Geneva. I think this is a very wise provision, honestly. Think of all the ways things can go wrong. Think of just the nature of the relationship between the associate and the senior, knowing that he could vie his way as the pastor somewhat simply, and even like coup the pastor out himself. You know, maybe that the associate's more popular than the senior. It protects the congregation and the church's ministry to have this on the minds. When I was an assistant pastor in Tuscumbia, this weighed on my mind, you know, when someone, because churches just do this, when someone comes up to you and says, oh, you know, Randy's retiring, you'd be a great senior pastor after him. The first thing I would think would be this passage, this section in the BCO, and it would ground me in saying, Scott, you know, there's no way this is going to happen, even if you wanted it. And it kind of humbles you to know, like, no, I'm not going to be that guy. It's just going to be way too difficult. It's almost insurmountable. And I think that's the intention of a parish like this, is to say, hey, it has to be a simple super majority of 4/5, 80% have to approve the call of the transition. And that's just not easy. Not to say you'd ever want to accept a call where you don't have 80%. I don't think you'd want to. I think you'd want to have like 96%. But it is still a moment of pause to cause you to reflect.
Yeah, we've had two churches that have had a pastor retire or move to a different church where they've called the assistant or the associate. And it made for more hurdles to jump over, but eventually they both were called. And I think it was good for the church to realize why that's in there. They had to have it explained of like, this is why it's in there. And it caused them to slow down a little bit to say, do we need to have a search committee? Do we need to talk about this, whether this is the direction we want to go? So while it's annoying for the church that's just like, the guy retired, we've been setting this guy up for this, still it's probably better that it's in here than if it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a good warning. I think it helps curb ambition, and Calvin talks about that being one of the greatest sins for pastors and clergy is the sin of ambition. And this is a section in our BCO that tries to curb our own ambitions.
We get into 23-2, and you'll start to see why these two matters are put into the same chapter. So 23-1 has to do with a pastor leaving a church for various reasons. 23-2 has to do with the fact of a minister retiring. So it's still a disconnect between him and the church, but it's for different reasons. So 23-2, the presbytery may designate a minister as honorably retired when the minister, by reason of age, wishes to be retired, or as medically disabled when by reason of infirmity is no longer able to serve the church in the active ministry of the gospel. A minister medically disabled or honorably retired shall continue to hold membership in his presbytery. He may serve on committees or commissions if so elected or appointed. Let's talk first about these reasons a man can honorably retire. One is age. So I guess the question would be, at what age? All of us young guys. Sorry, Jared, I'll pull you down a little bit for that comment. But what do we think? What have you seen? What's the practice? I guess maybe.
So what is it for a pilot? Like at 60, 65, like you have to retire or something like that. Pastors go way past that
of that policy. Yeah.
I think the one thing that popped into my mind is like, can somebody come back? Right? Like they get retired for age, and then they're like, no, I want to come back again. They do a Michael Jordan.
We had that happen in our presbytery. A guy was honorably retired, a TE, and he came back to pastor a church. He was only retired like a year, and somebody called him, and he said, okay. And so we had to do this weird dance at presbytery where we called him out of retirement. But age is the harder one to determine, of course, right? Medical necessity is a little bit easier to pinpoint. And these days we see lots, you see lots of people with diseases, the older they get, debilitating things that come upon them, and they just can't keep doing the work. And so it just becomes necessary for them to step aside so that the church can be served by somebody more able and inclined.
Yeah, I knew an OPC church that had a guy that had a stroke, and so had to do this. Even though his mind was actually there, he just couldn't speak anymore, and so had to retire for those reasons.
Yeah, I think keeping both of these pretty broad is good. Age is different for everyone. My Edburgs don't live a long time. Most of my family, they die in their 60s. And so I'm hoping that I'm here in my 70s, but I just know we don't live a long time. So maybe that's 58 for me. I'm gonna be honorably retired at 58, only with a few years left. But my wife's family, they live to 98. So my wife is gonna have to go 3 decades without me because my life expectancy is just so short. And so keeping these broad.
Geneva Benefits has a fund for widows of pastors, so you need to look into that.
Yeah, we're setting up all those right now for her. She might be a widow in 5 years.
My wife and I both have our families live a long time, and but most of the ladies on her side of the family wind up with dementia. So I just tease her that we're gonna live forever, but she's gonna go crazy. So. That's probably insensitive. Sorry, listeners, if there's anybody out there that is triggered by that.
Chapter 23. That's where the show went sideways.
Retiring ministers.
He maintains his membership in presbytery. I've seen this. This is really good. We've got a guy who he actually transferred his honorable retirement status to our presbytery from a previous one, and he serves on committees. He's available to preach because he retains his credentials. It's really helpful to have a guy like this who maybe isn't able to pastor a church full time, but can offer his services to the presbytery in committee capacities, but also in service functions. He can go to small churches and administer the sacraments if they need somebody, if they don't have a pastor. There's all sorts of things you can imagine somebody like this doing.
It's also helpful to know that it's his presbytery, so this isn't talking about some other presbytery necessarily. There are many guys, even in Ileana, that they retired here, they're given honorable status, but they live somewhere else, Florida or something like that. You don't have to, transfer or sunset all of your people to a Florida presbytery because that's where, they're at that Villages or something. That presbytery would have a lot of retired guys or something. They stay, their membership retains in the presbytery that they retire unless their request to transfer is complete. I sometimes get that question, why is that guy still on our books? Well, it's because he retired here. And so I know he doesn't come to presbytery. That's always a blessing when they do. But he's still a member in good standing of Ileana.
Ralph Davis was a member of Grace Presbytery for years, and when I served down there, he was honorably retired, lived elsewhere, didn't come to our meetings because he lived somewhere else, but he would always send a letter every single Presbytery meeting, and the clerk would read it, and it was always so... I mean, if you've ever read Ralph Davis or heard him preach, it was just punchy and witty and clever. He didn't have to. He had permanently excused absences, right, as honorably retired, but it was always so cheerful.
One of our retired ones always corrects the minutes when our clerk sends it out, finds every typo. So there's some great service that can be done by the retired pastors.
23-3, a minister being medically disabled or honorably retired may be elected pastor emeritus by a congregation which seeks to honor his past earnest labors among them.
It seems pretty straightforward, although we actually had an interesting exercise of this, and that we had somebody that was just an assistant pastor with us for 3 years, but had been a missionary on the mission field. And we decided to honor them this way because I think a lot of missionaries come back and they feel displaced or like nobody remembers their service. And so it was a way for us to honor missions, to say what they did was a pastoral role in a church in another country, and they came back, they served us for a time, and we want to honor them this way. So yes, this could be the guy that's 20, 30 years in the pulpit, but it may be a way to honor some other people that if you think a little bit outside the box.
I love it. Well, that's it for 23 on the dissolution of pastoral relationships and honorable retirement. Any final thoughts you guys want to drop for us before we head out?
This isn't the longest chapter title, by the way. I didn't have the heart. I was wondering when I would correct you or just allow it to be, but there's a longer chapter. Chapter 39 is way longer than this chapter title.
Always correct me, please.
Yeah, so you gotta check your facts. All this misinformation is being spread on our podcast.
What's the point of having y'all here if you don't correct me? That's you know.
When Scott honorably retires, he's still going to correct the minutes that are emailed to him.
I'm gonna that's gonna be me. I'm gonna be a thorn in that guy's side. I'll be 58 years old. Like, why is this guy honorably retired? He doesn't have much time left.
Well, good. As future honorably retired minute-checking Scott Edburg would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to come back next time when we move on to BCO 24, election, ordination, and installation of ruling elders and deacons. If you're interested in learning more about what we've discussed, you can check out our show notes, or you can go to politymatters.org and see all of that. If you've enjoyed the show, please, as we tell you always, follow us on Twitter, Facebook at Polity Matters, and subscribe in your podcast app of choice. Be sure to share this episode with friends if it's something they'd be interested in, or go back in the archives and find something that would be helpful for family, other Presbyterian people, Baptists that you want to convert to Presbyterianism. I mean, give them the Witherow episodes and watch them come along. It'll be great. If you have questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com, and there's also links where you can support our work. Thanks again, listeners, for spending your valuable time with us. Gentlemen, until next time, say goodbye.
So long.
Y'all take
Goodbye.
care.